Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're literally opening the door to what's arguably one of the most unsettling, enigmatic, and just flat out brilliant novels of the 20th century. I'm talking about Franz Kafka's The Trial. Now, whether you've actually read it cover to cover, or maybe you just throw around the term Kafkaesque from time to time, this story is an absolute labyrinth. It's baffled scholars for a century. But together, we're going to decode the whole shebang. The dense layers of bureaucracy, the psychoanalysis, and that deep existential dread Kafka wove into this masterpiece. So I want you to imagine this just for a second. You wake up in your own bed, in your own room, right? And two total strangers are just standing there to tell you that you're under arrest. But here's the catch. You weren't taken to prison. You aren't even told what your crime is. Your normal life just kind of goes on, except you're now hopelessly entangled in this invisible, all-powerful court system. Okay, let's dive into this, because this is exactly what happens to our main guy, Josef K.
Section 1. The Arrest of Josef K. An Inexplicable Intrusion.
Right off the bat, you've got to notice the frustrating, completely circular progression of K's trial. It kicks off on day one with that sudden arrest, and at first, he's confident. He thinks, oh, it's just a bureaucratic mistake. My rational mind can easily fix this. But then we hit month one, his first hearing. And it's not held in some grand courthouse. No, it's in a cramped, stifling attic. By year one, we're looking at just endless delays. It's like quicksand. The more K tries to fight the system, the more entangled he gets. And finally, on the literal eve of his 31st birthday, we reach his execution. So as you can see, this isn't a straight line to justice. Not at all. It's a gradual, agonizing descent into an inescapable labyrinth.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we can categorize the totally chaotic cast of characters surrounding K. First up, we have the functionaries, guys like the warders Willem and Franz, and the examining magistrate. Basically, they enforce rules they don't even understand themselves. Then you've got the false saviors, people like Advocate Holder and the painter Titorelli. They promise help, sure, but actually, they just pull K deeper into the mud of endless delays. And finally, we have the temptations, Fräulein Bürstner, Lenny. They don't offer salvation. Instead, they just trigger K's repressed desires. The crazy thing is, every single person he meets ultimately serves to empower the overarching system. Moving on to Section 2, the Bureaucratic Machine, the Absurd System. So this standard modernist reading of this book argues that K's world has been abandoned by an absent God, like it's a pure metaphor for modern absurdity. But academic research, specifically the Lacanian interpretation championed by Slavoj Žižek, flips this entirely on its head. The postmodern reading says, wait a minute, the problem isn't that God is absent. The real problem is that the bureaucratic big other, that symbolic network regulating reality, is this obscene presence that is just way too close. The system isn't ignoring K at all. It's practically breathing right down his neck. And this concept builds directly into Michel Foucault's framework of the bureaucratic machine. In the story, the painter Titorelli actually outlines the court's three and only three options for defendants. Step 1, genuine acquittal. This would completely end the trial, but yeah, it's practically impossible. Step 2 is apparent acquittal. This grants a temporary release, but it places the subject under eternal surveillance. Then there's step 3, protraction, where the trial is just permanently frozen at its lowest stage. Looking at this through a Foucauldian lens, it shows us something terrifying. The system doesn't want resolution. It feeds entirely on eternal indebtedness and unrelenting control.
Which brings us to Section 3, Psychoanalyzing Guilt, the Terror of Josef K. To truly understand K's internal terror, we really have to grapple with the Freudian concept of the superego. Think of it as that guilt-inducing agency operating deep in our unconscious. It exists basically to bridge the massive gap between our actual, deeply flawed selves and our completely impossible ideal selves. So the crucial point is that K isn't just being arrested by some random external force. Because literally no one can live up to their ideal self, K carries this constitutive guilt around inside him. Without even realizing it, K unconsciously hails the law to himself to punish him for failing to be perfect. Talk about being your own worst enemy, right? Let's actually map these Freudian concepts directly onto K's life. The id, the seat of our primitive, brute instincts, is represented by his repressed sexual desires for women like Leni and Fräulein Bürstner. Then we have the ego, which is K's frantic, self-preserving attempt to use rational logic to navigate the court. And finally, the superego is that overwhelming, completely unexplainable guilt just constantly hovering over him. Ultimately, K's tragic downfall is driven by his failure to place his rational ego in charge of those brute instincts.
He tries so hard to present himself as this perfectly logical bank clerk, but his internal contradictions completely betray him.
Let's look at Section 4, Psychosis and the Split Subject. The illusion shatters.
So as the story progresses, it turns out K isn't just, stressed out by a lawsuit. He is fundamentally fracturing. As highlighted in this fascinating excerpt from the International Journal of English Literature and Social Sciences, researchers have analyzed K's mental state through the actual clinical lens of psychosis and Edward Lorenz's chaos theory. K is desperately trying to project this outward image of rational order, but beneath that crisp exterior, his mind is in a constant state of flux. He's suffering from depersonalization, a severe dissociative state where his sensory information just completely fails to integrate. His rigid outward order is literally just masking a deep pathological internal disorder. And this naturally brings us to the Lacanian concept of the split subject. Very simply put, so we don't get bogged down in the jargon, it's the division between a person's actual flawed self and the shiny ideal identity they construct just to fit into society's symbolic order. Josef K is the ultimate split subject here. He desperately wants to be the perfect, rational citizen, but his true self is completely fraught with desires and flaws. And because he can't reconcile these two halves, he becomes trapped. He becomes deeply indebted to that bureaucratic big other we talked about, which constantly preys on his self-division. And this brilliantly illustrates the absolute corrosion of the Cartesian ego. We all know Descartes' famous maxim, right? I think, therefore I am. It's like the ultimate assertion of a rational subject commanding their own reality. But Kafka, he completely subverts this. K tries to think his way out of his trial, but reason entirely fails him. Instead of some total victory for rationality, pure irrationality and dissociative psychosis just seize the stage. He thinks, sure, yet he is utterly, completely powerless.
Finally, Section 5, the meaning of Kafkaesque, the unseen authorities.
Near the very end of the novel, K wanders into a cathedral and meets a priest, a character who basically represents the whole philosophical core of the story. When K passionately protests, saying, "How can a person be guilty anyway? We're all human," the priest delivers this incredibly chilling, perfectly logical reply. "That is correct, but that's the way guilty people talk." Wow. The priest then tells K this famous parable about a man who waits his entire life in front of an open door to the law, only to be told right as he's dying that the door was meant only for him and is now being shut. The truth is always just out of reach. And the guilt? Well, it's already assumed. Which leaves us with a final, really lingering question. The system Josef K fights isn't just some unfair government bureaucracy. It's the physical manifestation of human anxiety. It's the impossible demands of society and the crushing weight of our own unconscious guilt. If the most terrifying court in the world is actually the one inside your own mind, constantly observing your every flaw and feeding on your need for perfection, how do you ever prove your innocence? It's a pretty chilling thought to leave you with, and honestly, it's exactly why the trial remains an absolute masterpiece a whole century later. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep questioning those unseen authorities in your own life.